Good afternoon. I just want to say before I start, what a great privilege I think it is to be invited to speak to this group. It's just a sort of group that I was hoping might be interested in what I had to say. There's the question of who designed Adelaide is a very contested area, and some people get rather obsessed by it. I'm naturally an obsessive person, so it came quite naturally to me to be obsessed. But what I propose is something quite new and hadn't been proposed by anyone else before. But I think it does answer the question of who designed Adelaide and how they went about it. I always thought about Colonel Light sitting under a gum tree up on Green Hill, overlooking the plain. He had with him a plan that he'd been prepared in London, which I'll talk about later. And he had to decide how he was going to lay it out, because he wasn't asked to design Adelaide, he was asked to lay it out. And these are the exact words that he used. In reading about this, I started to read more. And I read, amongst other things, a dissertation written by a colleague of mine at Cambridge University, where he said that there might have been a preemptive model plan for Adelaide that was prepared in London. I think it was guesswork on his part, but it turns out he was perfectly correct. So I wanted to follow that up. And in searching through the Public Records Office, we found that there's a note in the public record that in the Colonial Office in London, a meeting of the building subcommittee invited members of the survey team to put forward designs for the city. And as I'll explain to you later, the design of cities was well understood. In fact, the design of colonial cities had been well understood for over 100 years. And I'll show you some examples of that in my presentation. So it just remains to be seen how that was done, how it was all put together by the two people who submitted their designs. And they were Finnis, who would be well known to you, but also a man by the name of O'Brien, who might have been the brains of the outfit at that time, but he was captured by the Mauritius government to go to Mauritius before the surveying party left for Australia. So O'Brien may well have been the designer of the preemptive model plan for Adelaide, together with Finnis. And Finnis will be well known to you people here, I understand. So I imagine Colonel Light sitting under a tree with the model plan in front of him, which may have been brought here by George Kingston in his pocket, because he was renowned for being secretive and not telling people the whole story. And he may have only given the plan to Light on the day that they arrived to inspect the site. But Light was able to immediately grasp what he could do with it, because he didn't have sufficient land on one side of the river. So he asked Mr. R.G. Thomas, the young assistant to Kingston, to get his scissors out of the knapsack. And so Light cut off the top of the plan and put one third of it across the northern side of the river and left the other 2/3 on the southern side. And I'll be showing you that in my in my presentation, which I'm about to start now. So that is a brief introduction to my presentation, which I'll now commence. The most important thing about the plan is that it fitted the topography perfectly. And that was, I think, a great skill of Light's in the experience that he'd had in the Peninsular Wars of establishing military positions. He learned how to put regiments in places where they would be most useful. In this case, he put parts of the city in places where they'd be most useful and where there was space to accommodate them. He did it in a few days. By February 7th, he knew exactly, in 7 days, he knew exactly, in principle, what he was going to do. And I'll show you a plan that relates to that. It wasn't an isolated example of genius. It was a team effort because he relied upon not only the people who'd prepared the preemptive plan, but also on his surveying team, including Mr. R.G. Thomas, who was only 16 years old at the time, and I'll explain more about him later, to assist him in putting it all together, because remember that he was suffering severely from tuberculosis. And finally, I want to mention on this slide that the design of cities was well understood for over 100 years because of the experience of establishing colonial cities in North America. And the antecedents prior to that are well known as well, but I'll show you some of those as we proceed. So we had the preemptive model plan, the model plan prepared in London, the capital city. The idea of parklands was first introduced, or many people have claimed credit for them, but they were first introduced by Maslow's book, The Friend of Australia. It's not very well known, that book, but you can buy copies of reproductions of it. And he had in that book a recommendation that every city in Australia should be surrounded by a belt of parklands, and described how wide they should be and how they should be constituted. And as it turns out, our parklands are exactly as he recommended. But since then, many other people have claimed credit for the idea. What I've done in my work is to take the existing city plan and see if I could re-engineer it or reverse engineer it back into a model plan which didn't envisage having a river running through the middle of it. Because as I explained before, the plan had to be split on both sides of the river. So I thought, take the river away and reverse engineer it. And I found to my amazement that it all fell into place almost immediately. I tried a number of different examples of how to do it, but there was only one real way that it all could fall into place. And I think you might be quite amazed to see how that was done. Here is an example of a colonial city in North America. This is Savannah. This is a really relatively well-developed example, but you can see the example of a grid plan. In opposition or in the reverse of organic planning that you would see in medieval cities, this was an engineered city of a grid of regular streets, a rectilinear arrangement with squares. And you'll notice that these would be about 4 acres wide, whereas our streets are about 8 acres wide. But you can see the similarity between this and the planning of Adelaide. So I'm simply making the point in showing this that Savannah predates Adelaide by quite a long way, but you can see that the planning of colonial cities was very well understood many years prior to Adelaide being designed. When Colonel Light arrived in Adelaide, and before he'd sent George Kingston through the wetlands or estuarine system that is now West Lakes between the Padawalunga and the Port River up to Torrens River, where he discovered the plain that now is the site of the City of Adelaide. He thought, because of his reading of what Sturt had written about the Padawalunga and Sturt River, that the city could be located around about Marion. So we can see a sketch that he'd prepared here and sent to a friend in London, that a city, this is Holdfast Bay, this is Outer Harbour, and here he has located a city at about Marion on the Sturt River, because there's a water supply which is essential to life. And you can tell that he'd investigated all this part of the foothills because of the way that he's described the geometry of it. So before he'd seen the Torrens River and investigated it with Kingston, he thought that the city would be best located at Marion, or where Marion is today. And in order to communicate with the harbour, he thought a canal roughly running through where West Lakes is at the moment, which is a sort of canal, I suppose you could say, and would connect all the way up to Marion through the creek system, probably the Sturt River. And it was a completely impractical arrangement, but was an idea he had, perhaps just a throwaway idea that he sent to a friend in London. You can see that in his design of the city, there are quite random squares marked out. If I could point that out again, just there. It doesn't show the geometry of the city that we understand today, and the geometry of a typical colonial city. So maybe, and I propose this, that Kingston hadn't shown him the plan. Kingston had it in his pocket and only showed him when they got to the site of Adelaide. That's quite a possibility. And Light hadn't seen the plain on which Adelaide now stands. Now, I've thought in my own mind, after reverse engineering it, I came back to a model plan that was as simple as this. If you multiply 32 on one side by 32 on the other side, it comes to 1,024 one-acre blocks of land. And 32 is divisible by 16, and it's divisible by 4. And it's possible to have a main street in the centre both ways. So it's quite a unique bit of geometry, 32 blocks by 32 blocks, that enabled him to have perfect geometry for the city. 1,024 was 24 blocks more than he had been instructed to provide. So there was always a possibility that there'd be a square or a number of squares. So for the purpose of this exercise, I just put one large square in the middle of 24 town acres. So we've got, in this model plan, we have 1,000 blocks for sale, for private sale, because that was his instruction from the Colonial Commission, and a central square with roads going through the central square both ways in the centre of the city. So that's an ideal model plan that based on what had been known for 100 years. So I thought, well, let's see if we can turn that into the plan of Adelaide. And then we show in this slide parklands surrounding the land of the 1,000 blocks. So parklands, as in Maslin's recommendation in The Friend of Australia, of parklands surrounding it. And the parklands was important from 2 points of view. Firstly, to provide public walks, recreation, which Light was meant to do, but it was also meant to contain public facilities. Because remember, the 1,000 blocks in the city were for private sale, not for public facilities. So any public facility that went in the city area, compensation had to be found by adding on further blocks, because he had to have 1,000 blocks for sale, because that was the economic model. But the other purpose of having the parklands is to restrict the area that was for sale, because there would be later the country sections provided around this 80-acre country sections around the city that would be purchased by the first purchasers of the city blocks. But this created a buffer zone between the city and the country. So by restricting supply, it created a value for the land in the city. And everyone who wanted an 80-acre block had to buy a block of land in the city to be eligible to buy into a country section. So this is not a terribly good slide, but I can point out to you that here is the topography with the river running through the middle. And Light, when he came, he had his temporary office about where the Royal Adelaide Hospital is at the moment. And he discovered that there was an escarpment along where West Terrace is. You can see the land falling away there. And along the edge of the river, he found there was an equally useful escarpment. So he had a nice right angle in there, and he could poke the city into this corner, or the 2/3 that he thought that he could fit at this end. The reason he couldn't put the whole city here on this side was A, he wanted to have more use of the river in the middle, and B, because there was a creek line over on this side by West Terrace. Now there's been frequent flooding of this area, and we've now got wetlands there to prevent the flooding. But there was also a creek line that runs into the Botanic Gardens. So this creek line here running into the Botanic Gardens restricted the distance he had from this escarpment to this end by one acre block, and that became very important, as I'll show you in another slide. So apart from that, you can see that he established in North Adelaide that there was, firstly in South Adelaide, there was a lovely, reasonably flat area which had a fall from this corner down to that corner, so that drainage would be quite possible. So this was a perfect area to create a city. There was a flat area up in this part of north of the river, and there's another little flat area in here, and there was a similar area along here that was not quite as flat, but reasonably useful. So he established set-out lines. Firstly, these two set-out lines, the limit here and the limit there, and the set-out lines in North Adelaide, there, and there. They were his, and he made them parallel to the river. You can see that it's parallel to this bit of river, parallel to that bit, and here parallel to that bit there. So he was setting back in a way that was geometrically sensible, of equal distance from the river. But overall, you can see that there's a radius here from this central point. And this, to Light, was the center of the universe, Government House. So he decided that nothing should be more than 1.4 miles from the governor. So he drew this radius here and there, and he made a decision not to put any part of the city outside of that radius if he could help it. He didn't quite succeed, but very close. Okay, I showed you the model plan before. So what he did was to get up, ask Mr. Thomas to pass in the scissors, and he cut off the top 1/3. Oh, you can see the creek line running through here. And so you see it intersected with this last 1 acre block. So in the next slide, you'll see He, at this stage, climbed up Green Hill and was standing a little bit below where the Green Hill CFS Centre is today. Andrew Davies and I walked up there the other day to take some photographs from there. And he drew what he thought was his initial idea. This is on February the 7th. You can see the 2/3 of the city on one side, and then the river through the middle, and 1/3 of the city on the other side, except that he cut the end off, the 1/3, and put it on Montefiore Hill, because that was a useful piece of land that he didn't want to give up, quite an interesting prominence, and he thought it might be useful. This is a sketch by light, which is full of notes, and Andrew Davies and I and another couple of friends have transcribed these notes, and I've included them in my book. If anyone's interested in purchasing my book afterwards, you can see this plan, this sketch by light, and the notes transcribed to explain what the various parts of it are. So here is an enlargement of that little sketch by light from Green Hill on February the 7th. And here I've interpreted it in my little model plan. I've taken the end bit off the top third and put it on Montefiore Hill. And I've distributed the squares, the 4 squares like there, and there, and added another square in the middle. So I'm now 8 town acres short, which have to be found at some time, because these are 4 squares of 6 town acres, which is the 24, which I had previously had in the middle. So I've got another 8, which is Victoria Square, and I've got to find. So that becomes very important at the very end of this exercise. So this is what light drew. So I think it shows pretty clearly that the prospect of it being a larger plan and just cut up into 3 pieces is a very realistic possibility. And you see that in this corner where the creek line runs through here, he chopped those blocks out over this distance of the creek line. And this creek line becomes terribly important later on East Terrace, because you know that the stepped nature of East Terrace relates to this creek line. So he put those blocks here. Now, this is a little story aside from what I've been talking about, but it's a good time to introduce it. That the whole idea of rectilinear, this kind of grid planning that I've been showing you, dates right back to Roman times, and the great architect Vitruvius, the Roman architect Vitruvius, who wrote his 10 books of architecture, which Gavin Walkley was still teaching us about in the 1950s at the School of Mines and Industries. And we learnt what Vitruvius had to say about city design back in the 1950s. So Vitruvius did the initial work, and Gavin Walkley said that he thought Adelaide could have been based on a Roman camp plan. And he's the only person to have really twigged to how it was done. And of course it's based on a Roman camp plan, but not directly back to the Romans and Vitruvius, but through the Renaissance. And we can find that in here we have the plans of Cataneo's plan in the Renaissance for a model plan in Italy, which shows almost exactly the geometry of the Adelaide plan. Now that is an interpretation in the Renaissance of Vitruvius's work, because of course in the Renaissance they were all looking at Rome as the font of all knowledge. So here we've got 4 squares and a centre square, main roads through the centre both ways, and rectilinear blocks, slightly not as wide as the Adelaide blocks, but that's an issue that we'll discuss later. But the geometry is basically this geometry. So how did it come to England? How did this design come from England? Well, that's another story of the Enlightenment period. Charles I sent Inigo Jones to Italy to buy a collection of paintings, and he went mainly to Venice and dealt with dealers in Venice to buy paintings for Charles I's collection. But while he was there, of course, Jones was an architect after all, and he brought back the introduction of Renaissance classical architecture, the work of Andrea Palladio in particular from the Veneto area, quite close to Venice. He brought all those ideas back to England and introduced them, and they became what we now know as Regency architecture. So the planning of cities followed the exact same pathway as that of Regency architecture all the way from Vitruvius in Roman times. So it explains it perfectly in my view. But how was it introduced to London? Well, then Inigo Jones was given the commission of designing a square in London, Covent Garden Square. Covent Garden was the first of the rectilinear city designs to be overlaid over the medieval city plan. And after that followed other examples, in Belgravia in particular, which many of you will be familiar with. Belgravia is a rectilinear design in the same way. So we now understand perfectly well how the basis of the design reached England and how it was then translated into colonial architecture through an understanding developed in the Renaissance and brought to England by Inigo Jones. So this is the plan of Philadelphia, which dates from 1683. So it's 50 years, more than 50 years, 60 years before the plan of Adelaide. But look, it has the rectilinear arrangement, the four squares, the central square in the middle, and the intersecting main roads going through the square. So I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever that the design of colonial cities was well known, and Finnis and O'Brien would have had no trouble establishing the geometry and submitting it as part of the competition that was held in London to design the City of Adelaide. So Colonel Light worked out that he had, I showed you before, a number of areas in North Adelaide which were suitable, reasonably flat areas that he could use. So he decided that he would cut up the plan. So he got the scissors out again, and he cut this section off, which went into Upper North Adelaide. Then he cut this section up into a number of bits. And he noticed that he cut them up into 4 blocks wide. And that's terribly important because it enabled him to spread things out more. So what he did was he split them up. He got the section that was marked E, he chopped off, and he put it down here because the creek line you can see running down there, he had a bit more room down this corner. He'd already chopped that off and added some blocks on here, so why not add some more? And then he pushed D into that little bit of flat land there and occupied the larger piece of flat land in Upper North Adelaide with that bit, and then pushed a bit on the end because there was a bit more room. And then out of desperation, he put C in 2 of those 4 block wide units of 8 blocks together at this end here. remember the government house is still here and we're still within the radius of 1.4 miles. Yes, well, no, it didn't quite work. He had to push things further together, though it was all a bit rough. So what he did was he pushed C further down towards the west. And to do that, he had to take some blocks out here, just at the top of Kingston Terrace. So he put them up here at the end of Man Street. So he took those 4 blocks and put them up there. He wanted to create a square here. So he took the 6 blocks out of Wellington Square and put them down here in McKinnon Parade. He wanted to come out onto Montefiore Hill, so he rotated blocks in this section here and put the remainder following the topography over on this side. To do it, he had to, because we had 8 blocks wide, in North Adelaide he wanted to go 6 blocks wide instead of 8. So he had 4 left over there and there. So he took those and popped them down here. That's all that he had to do. It was very straightforward. So remember I told you that he had to have 1,000 blocks, so he needed some more blocks. So he needed some for government offices as well. So he had 4 blocks here, the GPO, the Treasury building, the courts at this end. So he put those blocks down here, added them on to the southeast corner. Yes, the final result is as we see it here now. It's simply, you can reverse engineer this, as I'll do in a minute when I show you an animation of how it was done. You can reverse engineer this and go back to have exactly the model plan that we started with. It's really quite simple. There are so few moves in achieving it, but I think when I first wrote this paper, I called it How Colonel I Designed Adelaide Before Lunch. And I was only persuaded to write a serious paper about it by a senior academic at Adelaide University. And so I'm being very serious about what I thought was quite amusing to start off with. Now here's the drawing prepared by R.G. Thomas, who was a 16-year-old articled assistant to George Kingston. His parents articled into Kingston, and his parents were known to have said Kingston taught him nothing, which I think he taught Kingston something. That was my view of it. But here's this beautiful watercolour that you can see. It's housed in the Migration Museum on Pintor Avenue, one of the originals. It's all done in watercolour by a 16-year-old draftsman who went on to become a colonial architect, a very, very talented young man, and the son of the founders of the Register newspaper. You can see the parklands have now been developed, and you can see an important point that I want to emphasize is that because there was no space for public facilities other than the 4 blocks that Light had taken out of around Victoria Square, public facilities had to be put in what we call the parklands. So when we say there should be no building in the parklands, it was always Light's intention to have public facilities, including public buildings, such as the hospital here, the Armoury and Police Barracks, which still stand today at the back of the museum, Government House, there's a native school up here, and other facilities in the parklands, which show on other maps, but the cemetery here as well. So it was always intended by Light to have public facilities, but not private development in the parklands. And so we can blame the current government, I think, for stepping aside from that rule. Very unfortunately, let's hope it's contained to just behind Parliament House. There's no guarantee of that unless we're all vigilant. So this is a plan showing a detail of North Adelaide, and interesting to see this is very Victorian, these little walks in the squares. They were called by the colonists twistifications, and they occur in all of the squares. You can see here is the store and the school, the barracks and the government domain. In South Adelaide, you can see the original government domain was meant to be right at the end of King William Street. So the government house would have a vista all the way down King William Street, and it was intended to put a cathedral in the square. But due to the politics of the day, it wasn't able to be achieved, and the cathedral went to North Adelaide. So many people have criticised, including Archibald Grenfell Price, criticised the design of Adelaide in that 8-acre blocks together were too wide and it didn't allow enough communication between one street and the other. But as you can see, this is a map I've drawn of all the little lanes that have been built. And the lanes have increased intensity according to what was needed in the particular locality. So in North Adelaide, you see very few lanes in the western end of North Adelaide because there are grand houses there and they didn't need lanes and didn't want them. But in parts of the southwest corner, you see there are many, many lanes because people needed to communicate from one side of the street, one street to another. And you could take commercial advantage of building smaller streets. And of course, Gawler Place is a prime example of a street being created to provide better accessibility to the city. So now I'm going to show you an animation of how it was done. I'll try to keep up with it, but here's the topography with a radius of 1.4 miles, and here are the areas that Light identified for the city, and showing here that he couldn't build at this end. The escarpments around the edge define the area, particularly in this end of North Adelaide, and you can see the set out points that I've drawn. Now here's the model plan, and we break the model plan up, the parkland surrounding, the grid geometry, symmetry of the street pattern, 32 blocks square, and here we break the top bit off. We cut the top bit into halves and put it into sections. We move the squares out, move these blocks down to this position, move that bit up into the big flat area in North Adelaide, move this section C and break it up down to this corner, move those two sections there, and then pull it all together. The final fit, it comes together. Those blocks go there. This block goes there, and you watch this here particularly. This is very clever, this bit, with the lovely topography in that corner, and just rotate those blocks onto Montefiore Hill, and then Wellington Square comes down here to put those blocks. So, and then the 4 blocks that we're missing there come over to here and added onto this area like that. The government domain remains in this position. So then we have the final design. Exactly. And we can reverse engineer it so you can watch it all happening in reverse, going from the plan back to the model plan. So my conclusion is that Colonel Light did have a model plan, but it was designed in London as by Finnis and O'Brien, that Kingston kept it in his pocket and didn't show Light until the last minute. But Light, being a brilliant man and having great experience in the Peninsular Wars, was able to cut it all up and distribute it over the topography. And we're, I think, a work of great genius nevertheless. Since writing this, I've thought, well, if that's the case with establishing a city, surely the rest of the history of the settlement of South Australia deserves a bit of a look. So I particularly followed the exploits of Colette Barker, who was sent to explore the eastern coastline of St Vincent Gulf. And Andrew Davies and I went up to Whitton Clyne. We drove up there to the point that Colette Barker stood on Green Hill, having walked all the way from Noarlunga with his party, and had a look at what he saw from there. And it seems pretty obvious that similarly things have been missed in the history of writing the settlement of South Australia. And I've written a second book of that history, and I'm hoping it will be published at the end of the year. And with a bit of luck, I might be invited back to talk about that. Thank you very much.